Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever stopped to truly wonder where our sense of right and wrong comes from? Not just, what society tells us, but that deep internal feeling of ought or ought not. Today, we're marking on a fascinating deep dive into the evolution of morality. We'll be pulling from a really rich stack of biological and philosophical insights to explore the very roots of our moral sense.
It's a profoundly human question, isn't it? One that's captivated thinkers for millennia. What's truly compelling here, I think, is that we're moving beyond purely philosophical or theological explanations. We're actually looking at how Darwinian natural selection might have sculpted our capacity for moral judgment. Our mission, really, is to understand not just what morality is, but why we humans possess it.
Yeah.
And what that ultimately implies for how we perceive our ethical landscape.
Right.
We're going to ask if understanding morality's origins fundamentally undermines its authority, or if it simply reframes our understanding of, well, one of our most defining human traits. This isn't about us making moral pronouncements, of course, but about critically examining the foundational mechanisms within our minds that allow us to make them in the first place.
So what does this all mean for you, our listener? We're going to challenge some deeply held assumptions, explore some surprising scientific and philosophical ideas, and by the end, you'll have a brand new lens, hopefully, through which to view your own moral compass and the intricate moral tapestry of human society. Let's set the stage by diving into some foundational science. When we discuss innate behaviors in evolution, a term that often surfaces is sociobiology. Now, in the realm of animal behavior, think the intricate societies of bees, the organized colonies of ants, or even like the complex family dynamics of burrower bugs. Sociobiology, which explains social behavior through biology, has been widely accepted. It's been incredibly successful. We see scientific headlines on the social structures of these creatures, and, no one really bats an eye. But when these same sociobiological ideas were first applied to humans, it caused, well, let's just say, an incendiary reaction. Why such a heated controversy when humans entered the picture?
That's a great question, and it really highlights how sensitive we are, perhaps understandably, when applying biological explanations to ourselves. The term sociobiology definitely became controversial, especially when it was extended to human behavior back in the 1970s and 80s. However, it's crucial to understand that the field largely reinvented itself. It underwent a significant conceptual shift and emerged as evolutionary psychology.
Okay.
And this was much more than just a rebranding. It was a fundamental change in focus. Sociobiology, in its original form, tended to focus on explaining innate behaviors directly. Evolutionary psychology, by contrast, shifted its gaze to the psychological mechanisms that, underlie those behaviors. This distinction is absolutely vital for understanding why it's less controversial today.
Right, so it's about the tools, not necessarily the outcome.
Exactly. The key difference is this. A psychological mechanism might have been an adaptation, exquisitely designed by natural selection to produce adaptive behavior in a prehistoric ancestral environment. But when that same mechanism operates in creatures living in a drastically novel environment, like our complex modern world, its output, the observable behavior, might be entirely different, perhaps surprising or even maladaptive.
Like our sugar cravings.
Precisely. Think about our innate craving for sweet, fatty foods. For our ancestors, sugar and fat meant high-calorie, safe energy sources, highly adaptive for survival. Today, in an environment saturated with cheap, processed sugar and fat, that same mechanism can lead to obesity and chronic health problems. The mechanism itself is an adaptation, but its modern outcome isn't necessarily that. And there's another layer. Evolutionary psychology doesn't necessarily claim that all adaptations manifest as cross-cultural universals in human behavior. An evolved mechanism can be designed to be highly environmentally sensitive. It might only be activated under specific environmental triggers, or it might not even develop properly if those triggers aren't present during critical developmental periods.
Okay.
Universality in behavior is only expected in the absence of such defeaters, as they're sometimes called. So when we talk about innate behaviors within evolutionary psychology, we're really referring to behaviors generated by an innate mechanism when it operates in accordance with its original design in ancestral environments, not necessarily every single behavior produced by that mechanism today.
That's a really important clarification. It helps clear up a lot of the initial misunderstandings and anxieties. So if I'm hearing you right, the key takeaway is that evolutionary psychology isn't about our behaviors being rigidly hardwired, but our mental tools, our psychological mechanisms are. And those tools, like our craving for sugar, can produce totally different, even unhelpful behaviors in our modern world than they did for our ancestors. But still, the term evolutionary psychology itself can feel a bit vague. How much of the human mind is it really trying to explain? Is it just a few basic instincts, or does it claim to account for complex cognitive functions too?
That vagueness is a very fair point, and it absolutely contributes to ongoing confusion. Typically, the scope of evolutionary psychology implies that a great deal of the human mind is to be explained by these evolutionary pressures. The common idea is that the mind consists of many, perhaps hundreds, of innate, domain-specific psychological mechanisms, each evolved to respond to a particular ancestral threat or opportunity, like a cheater detection mechanism or a face recognition mechanism. But where do we draw the line? How many of these mechanisms or how much of the mind must be explained this way before someone truly earns the label evolutionary psychologist? There isn't really a clear, widely agreed upon demarcation. This means the sensible idea that basic faculties of the mind evolved can easily blur into more controversial, sweeping claims about explaining a lot of human mentality and behavior through biological natural selection. It's a gradient, not a switch.
It sounds like our brains are incredibly complex organs, but also remarkably adaptable. I mean, we can surf the web, read Shakespeare, navigate the intricate streets of Manhattan behaviors that certainly were around in ancestral environments. How does that open-ended plasticity, this incredible flexibility, fit into this evolutionary framework?
You've hit on a core feature of human cognition. Despite the existence of innate mechanisms, the human brain is truly an organ, designed, you might say, to deal with environmental variation par excellence. Our extraordinary range of behaviors, from complex abstract thought to navigating highly artificial novel environments, simply cannot all be programmed by conditional instructions within our genome.
Right. There isn't enough space in code, so to speak.
Exactly. The human genome, vast as it is, simply isn't large enough to contain instructions for every conceivable contingency, especially for entirely new stimuli like the internet or the rules of a game like chess. So this malleability, this open-ended plasticity, isn't some accident or a flaw in the design. It's a fundamental design feature of the human brain, selected for its adaptive benefits.
Oh, okay.
Natural selection, in its, wisdom, found that what an ancestor encountered and learned within their own lifetime, including what they learned by observing and imitating others, provided a far more reliable and up-to-date basis for practical decision-making than fixed instructions based solely on what past generations had encountered. This profound capacity to learn and adapt to wildly varying and unpredictable conditions is arguably what truly sets us apart in the animal kingdom. It's what allowed us to colonize every corner of the planet.
That makes perfect sense. We have these underlying evolved predispositions, but the specific targets or contents of those predispositions are often learned. Take emotions, for example. We all have the innate capacity for fear, but what we fear can vary wildly from person to person or culture to culture.
Absolutely. The existence of core emotions like fear, happiness, jealousy, or guilt, and the specific ways they manifest is deeply rooted in our evolutionary past.
Yeah.
Having these emotions and having these particular emotions provided our ancestors with consistent benefits, leading to their selection and refinement over generations. The capacity for fear is indeed fixed. Nearly all humans, except those with very specific brain damage, reliably experience it. However, what elicits that fear? Whether it's a stalking leopard, a venomous snake, a looming stock market crash, or even the abstract concept of societal judgment that is largely learned from our environment, our personal experiences, and our cultural input. This dual nature, a fixed, innate capacity, coupled with flexible, learned content, is incredibly adaptive. In any ancestral environment, there was always something that posed a threat. But the precise nature of those threats could vary significantly across different times and places. An intriguing possibility, which our sources touch on, is that some fears might have somewhat fixed content if the threat was reliably present throughout our evolutionary history. For example, some researchers argue that humans are prepared to find snakes and spiders frightening far more readily than novel dangers like guns or power sockets.
Right, because of that long ancestral exposure.
Exactly, due to the consistent ancestral exposure to the former. While empirical evidence for universally fixed fears can be complex and sometimes conflicting, the general principle holds. We are wired to respond to broad, reliable environmental threats and opportunities with determined yet adaptable emotional responses. Our interest in food and sex are prime examples of this fixed yet flexible motivational system, where the drive is innate, but the specific objects of desire can be shaped.
This very idea of things being fixed or innate often makes people uncomfortable, leading right into that old, persistent accusation of genetic determinism. It's a phrase often chanted until it lodges in popular consciousness, and you argue that this is a misconception, a dead and buried dichotomy. Let's tackle that head on. Could you elaborate on why this accusation is largely incorrect, particularly when we're talking about the evolution of human morality?
The accusation of genetic determinism against sociobiology and now evolutionary psychology is indeed a persistent and frankly unfortunate straw man that has plagued these fields for decades. No sensible person involved in these discussions, and certainly no prominent sociobiologist or evolutionary psychologist, is a genetic determinist. The nature-nurture dichotomy is truly dead and buried because it radically oversimplifies a complex and intricate interplay. Modern science overwhelmingly recognizes that both genes and environment are essential, constantly interacting to shape who we are.
So it's always both.
Always both. To suggest that human morality, or any complex human trait, is genetically programmed, does not in any way deny the centrality of cultural influence, nor does it imply that any specific manifestation of morality is inevitable or unchangeable. Whether environmental factors easily affect or even entirely prevent the development of a genetically encoded trait is always an empirical question. It varies greatly from one trait to another. Consider phenylketonuria, or PKU. It's a genetic metabolic disorder that, if left untreated, causes severe mental retardation. Yet its symptoms can be almost entirely avoided with a restricted diet. Compare that to Down syndrome, a genetic disorder where, at present, little can be done to avoid its characteristic features. There's no general, simple, one-size-fits-all relationship between genotype and phenotypic expression. So when prominent critics like Stephen Jay Gould claim that if we are programmed, our traits are ineluctable, meaning unchangeable or inevitable, he was profoundly mistaken about the biological realities. Genetic predispositions provide a tendency, a capacity, or a preparedness, not an unalterable destiny. Our innate capacity for language, for instance, doesn't mean we're born speaking Japanese or Swahili. It means we're prepared to learn a language, and our social and cultural environment determines which one and, to what level of proficiency.
Right, like a language acquisition device.
Exactly. Similarly, an innate moral sense might mean we're prepared to develop a morality, while culture, upbringing, and personal experience fill in the specific content and contours of that morality. However, it's also plausible that natural selection has favored certain broad moral universals attitudes with some fixed content, like finding it generally abhorrent to harm helpless children, especially in ancestral environments where such actions were consistently detrimental to group survival and individual fitness. Learning can be costly and dangerous, so some hardwired content for consistently harmful acts would be incredibly efficient.
It seems like these evolutionary discussions, particularly when applied to human behavior, often get tangled up with political motivations and ideological discomforts. There's this bizarre presupposition, as you've noted, that Darwinian psychology has obvious political ramifications, even Marxist motivations influencing some earlier critiques. Why is it so crucial to maintain intellectual impartiality when evaluating scientific theories, even if they make us uncomfortable or challenge our preferred social narratives?
This is a critically important point for any honest intellectual inquiry. Historically, there were explicit attempts to guide research by a conscious application of Marxist philosophy, as some prominent researchers proudly declared during the sociobiology debates.
Wow.
Yeah. This reveals a dangerous and anti-scientific tendency to let political preferences dictate the acceptance or rejection of scientific theories rather than letting the evidence speak for itself. The truth is, demonstrating profound political implications from Darwinian psychology requires a very careful, complex, and nuanced argument, which has, frankly, rarely been provided to an adequate standard. The past fears that sociobiology would somehow exonerate racism, sexism, or classism, or suggest they were inevitable, were indeed naive and ultimately ill-founded. An evolutionary explanation for a behavior, even one we find obnoxious or morally reprehensible, does not validate it, excuse its perpetrators, or prove that attempts to correct or mitigate it are futile. For instance, if evolutionary psychology were to show that the human mind is adapted to living in relatively small, extended family groups, this alone wouldn't justify such a living arrangement, prove it unavoidable in modern society, or even guarantee it would make us happy.
Right. Selection isn't about happiness.
Exactly. Natural selection, after all, doesn't prefer happy organisms. It prefers reproductively successful ones. The policy of denying a scientific theory based on discomfort with its potential practical or social implications, rather than its empirical support, is fundamentally flawed and ultimately hinders true understanding and progress. Science must strive for impartiality, allowing the evidence to lead where it may, regardless of our comfort.
And on that note of impartiality, another common trap, perhaps the most persistent and frustrating one, is the claim that all human action, even our most helpful or morally virtuous acts, are really selfish when viewed through an evolutionary lens. The phrase selfish gene often gets misinterpreted this way, leading to a really cynical view of human nature. Can you clarify why this is a fundamental blunder and how it often conflates different explanatory levels?
This is a crucial point, and it's a very, very common misunderstanding that really muddies the waters. It's what I call a basic blinger of confusing the cause of a mental state with its content. Let's first clarify some terms to cut through the confusion. Helpful behavior. This is simply behaving in a way that benefits another individual. Straightforward. Fitness-sacrificing behavior, or evolutionary altruism. This is when an individual advances another's reproductive fitness at the expense of their own. It's a genuine sacrifice from a genetic perspective. Altruism, or psychological altruism. This is acting with the intention of benefiting another, motivated by a non-instrumental concern for their welfare. This is distinct from selfishness, where your ultimate motive is always self-gain.
Okay, those distinctions are key.
They really are. Philosophers known as psychological egoists claim that all actions are ultimately done from the motive of self-gain. However, this view is almost certainly wrong. Empirical evidence, which we'll dig into more later, strongly suggests humans are often motivated by genuine regard for others. Now, regarding the selfish gene blunder, when people make statements like Richard Dawkins's "we are born selfish," or Michael Gislin's provocative "scratch an altruist and watch a hypocrite bleed," they are committing this error. Let's use an example. Suppose Fred is devotedly looking after his sick wife, motivated by his deep love for her and genuine desire to alleviate her suffering. An evolutionary psychologist might explain that Fred's capacity for such love is a proximate psychological mechanism that was favored by natural selection, because looking after a spouse historically enhanced reproductive advantage, by ensuring help and raising offspring and maintaining a stable household. This is a perfectly valid evolutionary explanation for the existence of Fred's love.
Okay, makes sense.
But this explanation reveals absolutely nothing about the content of Fred's conscious motivations. It doesn't mean Fred really cares about his reproductive fitness at a conscious level, or that his deep care for his wife is merely derivative of some unconscious genetic agenda. Fred genuinely loves his wife, and his desire is to help her. The evolutionary cause of that love is entirely distinct from its conscious psychological content.
That's a really important distinction, cause versus content.
Exactly. To conflate these two levels of explanation, the ultimate evolutionary cause and the proximate psychological motive, is a cynical mistake that obscures the actual complexity of human psychology. My goal throughout this deep dive is to carefully explore how natural selection might favor not just helpful behavior in general, but specifically the trait of acting from psychologically altruistic motives and making complex moral judgments, precisely because these mechanisms help to effectively regulate and promote cooperation and helpful behavior within social groups.
Okay, so with that foundation laid, the big question is, how on earth does natural selection, which often feels so brutally competitive, manage to create something as profoundly complex as cooperation and genuine helpfulness? This is where it gets truly mind-bending. Our sources break it down into 4 key pathways that explain how helpfulness can evolve even in the most seemingly ruthless environments.
You're right, it is mind-bending. Natural selection isn't solely about individual competition. It has several elegant and powerful mechanisms for fostering cooperation and helpfulness. These are the primary evolutionary processes for developing helpful traits, observed across the animal kingdom, and they lay the essential groundwork for understanding our unique human moral sense. Kin selection, mutualism, reciprocity, and group selection. We'll delve into each of these to see how they have shaped our capacity for prosocial behavior.
Okay.
Let's begin with kin selection, often encapsulated by the sentiment, blood is thicker than water. The core principle here is mathematically captured by Hamilton's rule. A trait where an individual helps others at some cost to themselves can be favored by natural selection if RBC.
Okay, break that down for us.
Sure. R stands for the degree of genetic relatedness between the helper and the recipient. B is the benefit to the recipient's reproductive fitness. And C is the cost to the helper's own reproductive fitness. So if the genetic relatedness times the benefit outweighs the cost, helping behavior can spread through a population.
Uh-huh.
In social insects like bees and ants, which belong to the order Hymenoptera, the degree of relatedness is often unusually high due to their unique haplodiploid genetic system. This explains why we observe such extreme, self-sacrificial helping behavior like worker bees literally sacrificing their lives for the colony. This rule beautifully explains how altruism within families, where shared genes are common, acts as a powerful, albeit indirect, way to propagate one's own genetic material. You're helping copies of your genes survive, even if they're housed in another body.
That makes perfect sense for family members and genetically close individuals, like in an insect colony. But it seems to run into a wall when we consider the full spectrum of human morality. In many human traditions, including our own, favoring your own family too much is actually seen as a vice. We call it nepotism for a reason.
Right.
Plus, kin selection, by definition, doesn't directly explain helping non-kin, which is obviously a massive and crucial part of human morality, from charity to civic engagement. If two creatures are completely unrelated, R would be 0, right? Making Hamilton's rule unable to account for any costly, helpful behavior towards them. So how can kin selection still be important for understanding broader human helpfulness beyond just our immediate relatives?
That's an excellent challenge, and it's precisely where the fascinating subtleties of evolutionary mechanisms come into play, extending their explanatory power beyond the obvious. Kin selection still matters immensely for understanding human helpfulness, even toward non-kin, for two main, often overlooked reasons. First, consider fallible kin recognition mechanisms. Natural selection often doesn't design perfect, highly precise detectors for genetic relatedness. Instead, it frequently opts for coarse-grained mechanisms because they are simpler, more metabolically efficient, and work perfectly well in typical ancestral environments.
Like rules of thumb.
Exactly like rules of thumb. For example, instead of a precise sibling detector, it might favor a more general, familiar from childhood detector. Think about how chick hatchlings imprint on the first moving object they see, usually their mother, but it could be a human, or even a red cube.
Right.
This simple coarse mechanism works reliably in nature because the first moving object is almost always their mother. Similarly, the Westermarck hypothesis, strongly supported by studies of Israeli kibbutzim children and Taiwanese minor marriages, suggests that humans develop an aversion to sexual attraction for anyone they are raised with during early childhood, irrespective of actual genetic relatedness. This is a powerful, simple mechanism for incest avoidance. Now, if human helping towards kin is regulated by a simple, evolutionarily ancient rule like provide help and affection to those conspecifics with whom you interact frequently and intimately during early development, and we now live in massively larger, more complex societies where we interact intimately with vastly more non-kin than our ancestors ever did, this mechanism can misfire or generalize. It can mistakenly trigger feelings of affection, loyalty, and helpfulness towards non-kin. It's an adaptive mechanism operating in a truly novel environment, extending its reach.
Okay, that makes sense. And the second reason?
Second, consider co-opted mechanisms. Natural selection is fundamentally conservative. It doesn't typically build entirely new structures or psychological faculties from scratch. Instead, it's a tinkerer. It often bends and tweaks old structures to new purposes, repurposing existing mechanisms for novel tasks.
Right, evolution works with what's already there.
Precisely. A classic example is the hormone oxytocin. In mammals, it's deeply involved in regulating maternal nurturing behavior and mother-offspring bonding. But oxytocin is an incredibly ancient hormone, found even in primitive mollusks. Over millions of years of vertebrate evolution, its role has been tweaked and expanded to encourage pair bonding in monogamous species, and even to extend feelings of trust and helpfulness beyond the immediate family to broader social interactions.
Wow.
So if kin selection provided our distant ancestors with the foundational psychological and physiological structures for regulating helpful behavior and affection towards family, those very structures became available to be tweaked for new tasks like helping individuals outside one's genetic family if selective pressure is pushed in that direction. It's a beautifully efficient way to build complexity.
That's a fascinating idea, that our deep-seated ancient mechanisms for family love could be the raw material, the foundational blueprint for broader social connections and even empathy for strangers. It naturally raises the question of the very nature of love in this context. If love is ultimately driven by the cold calculus of gene propagation, can it still be sincere? Or is it really selfish at some deeper hidden level, making us all unwitting biological agents?
This is a really important and powerful philosophical question, and it brings us back to that crucial distinction we made earlier between the ultimate evolutionary cause of a mental state and its proximate psychological content. Kin-selected love, even if it's genetically choosy in its origins, can absolutely be genuinely other-regarding, non-instrumental, and psychologically altruistic. It's decidedly not really selfish in the way critics often imply. Think about it this way. If someone has an innate, genetically influenced preference for heterosexual partners, that's a conditionality, a form of choosiness. But their love for a specific partner isn't thereby selfish. It can be profound, self-sacrificing, and genuinely other-directed.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, natural selection would specifically favor a non-derivative, other-directed love for genes residing in others, especially close kin. Why? Because a love that was ultimately centered on the self, where you only cared about another's welfare because it ultimately benefited you in a conscious, calculating way, simply couldn't reliably support the kind of deep commitment and self-sacrifice that kin selection often calls for.
Right, it wouldn't be strong enough.
Exactly. When some of your genes that matter are housed in your kin, natural selection will favor a genuine, unconditional love for them that could drive you to make sacrifices, sometimes even life-threatening ones, with zero probability of direct reciprocation. A purely self-directed love wouldn't reliably lead a parent to sacrifice their life for their child, for instance, but a true unconditional love would.
And there's evidence for this genuine altruism.
Absolutely. Empirical evidence strongly supports this view that humans are often motivated by genuine regard for others, not ultimately by hidden selfish motives. We observe people punishing transgressors even at a cost to themselves, and often, even when they are completely unaffected, disinterested observers of the transgression.
Yeah, like getting mad when someone cuts in line far ahead of you.
Precisely that feeling. Studies by researchers like Ernst Fehr and Simon Gefter, or Scott Vootel and colleagues using fMRI, have repeatedly demonstrated this willingness to incur costs to enforce fairness or punish unfairness. The view that all human actions are ultimately guided by some profit-hungry homunculus, relentlessly pursuing its own gain, is a cynical mistake, largely unsupported by evidence and failing to capture the richness of human motivation. While humans are certainly capable of selfishness, there's compelling proof of genuine, other-regarding concern and action. Next, let's explore reciprocity, a pathway that's distinct from true fitness-sacrificing altruism. This involves an exchange where both parties ultimately benefit, though not necessarily simultaneously. It's different from true evolutionary altruism because in the end, it's mutually advantageous. Robert Travers, who famously coined the term reciprocal altruism, defined the behavior as apparently detrimental to the organism performing the behavior, emphasizing the short-term cost balanced by a long-term gain.
Oh.
So it's not evolutionarily altruistic in the strict sense of a genuine fitness sacrifice, but rather a form of fitness advancement over the long term, where both individuals come out ahead through a series of give-and-take interactions.
So it's more like a mutually beneficial trade, even if there's a time lag between the giving and receiving. The classic model for understanding the challenges and opportunities of such reciprocal exchanges is the prisoner's dilemma, a staple of game theory. Can you briefly explain how that game illustrates these dynamics and why cooperation is often so difficult to achieve?
The prisoner's dilemma, or PD, is a remarkably powerful and elegant model. It typically involves two individuals, often imagined as criminals arrested and interrogated separately, who must simultaneously decide whether to cooperate with each other, stay silent, or defect, betray the other. The payoff structure is crucial. The temptation to defect T is better than the reward for mutual defection, P, which is better than the sucker's payoff S, so TRPS.
Got it. TRPS.
Right. And additionally, two mutual rewards are better than one temptation and one sucker's payoff, so 2RT plus S. This payoff structure reveals the core dilemma. Individually, defection is always the rational, self-interested choice, regardless of what the other player does. However, if both choose to defect, they both end up worse off than if they had both cooperated.
The classic tragedy of the commons, in a way.
Exactly. The dilemma beautifully highlights why cooperation is inherently hard to achieve without trust, some form of pre-commitment, or external enforcement, even when cooperation would lead to a better outcome for everyone involved. It's a powerful illustration of how individual rationality can lead to collective suboptimality.
And in repeated interactions of the prisoner's dilemma, the famous tit-for-tat strategy, or TFT, often comes out on top in simulations, right? Where you start by cooperating and then simply do whatever your opponent did in the previous round. But the real world is messy. It's not a perfectly controlled game. What are some of the critical limitations of TFT when you try to apply it to real-world reciprocal exchanges where things aren't as neat as a game theory model?
TFT's celebrated triumph in simplified PD tournaments is often a product of the game's highly controlled and idealized setup. In the chaotic, imperfect conditions of the real world, TFT indeed falters in several critical ways.
Okay.
First, simultaneity versus time lag. The classic PD assumes perfectly simultaneous choices. However, real reciprocal exchanges rarely happen this way. There are often significant time lags between actions, making it harder to perfectly track and reciprocate. Second, infallibility versus noise. In the real world, mistakes in communication, accidental fumbles, or misinterpretations of intent are common. If one TFT player mistakes a genuine cooperation for an accidental defection, what we call noise in the system, it can trigger a disastrous, escalating cycle of mutual defection,
Oh, right. That sounds bad.
leading to a complete breakdown of trust and cooperation. It's very unforgiving of errors. Third, complexity tax. Strategies aren't free. They require cognitive resources. TFT requires more cognitive effort and discriminatory skills remembering past actions, assessing intentions, than simply always cooperate, all LC, or always defect, all D. In a population composed only of TFT and all LC players, all C players, despite their apparent naivety, might actually have a fitness advantage due to their lower cognitive costs, potentially allowing them to take over.
Huh. Interesting trade-off.
Definitely. Fourth, reputation. We rarely interact with strangers in a vacuum. We often observe others' past interactions, gather information about their trustworthiness, and assess their reputation before deciding to engage. This indirect reciprocity affects our strategy, a crucial factor not typically modeled in basic PD games. Fifth, refusal to play. In real life, you're not locked into a game. You can choose to abandon an interaction or switch partners if a current partner is pursuing an unpleasant or exploitative strategy, unlike being forced to continue playing in a fixed game.
Yeah, you can just walk away.
Exactly. Finally, punishment. TFT's punishment is relatively weak, simply reciprocating defection, meaning you withhold future cooperation. However, Robert Trivers' concept of moralistic aggression in humans suggests a much stronger positive penalty like public disapproval, social ostracization, or even direct violence. This form of punishment is far more impactful and costly than mere non-cooperation and is central to human morality. These nuances demonstrate that real-world cooperation is far more complex and robust than simple TFT alone can explain.
That's fascinating how a seemingly optimal strategy like TFT, which works so well in a clean theoretical setting, kind of falls apart with a little bit of real-world messiness and complexity. I remember reading about another strategy, Pavlov, often called win, stay, lose, shift. How does that one succeed, particularly when noise, those accidental errors, is introduced into the system? And what does its success imply about our understanding of reputation?
Pavlov, the win, stay, lose, shift strategy, indeed offers a compelling and often more successful alternative to TFT, especially when the real world introduces noise. Its genius lies in its simplicity and adaptability. If a move was successful, win, repeat it. If it was unsuccessful, lose, switch it.
Simple enough.
Right, where Pavlov truly shines and often outperforms TFT is precisely in noisy environments. If two Pavlov players are cooperating and one accidentally defects noise, the other Pavlov player will lose and switch to defection. The first player, having accidentally won by defecting, might initially stay with defection. But after that mutual defection, both players lose, so they immediately shift back to cooperation.
It recovers quickly.
Exactly. It allows for quick recovery from accidental errors, preventing the destructive spiraling defection that can doom TFT. However, where Pavlov truly earns its place is its ruthless efficiency in exploiting foolishly friendly all-LC, always cooperate players.
Yep.
If a Pavli player encounters an ALC player, it can continually defect against them, winning big, and the ALC player will tragically keep cooperating. This capacity to exploit unconditional cooperators contributes significantly to Pavli's success in a mixed population, especially with noise in the system, where it can weed out those who are indiscriminately helpful and therefore vulnerable.
So being too nice can be a liability evolutionarily. What does this mean for reputation then?
Well, this success carries a significant implication for our understanding of reputation. It suggests that in real-world scenarios, a sophisticated reputation system shouldn't just track past defections to identify cheats. It should also track whether someone is an unconditional cooperator, someone who can potentially be exploited. Gathering this kind of granular information about other strategies, even their vulnerabilities, becomes key, though it too comes at a cognitive and social cost. Organisms might even purposely defect or test other strategies, engaging in experimental defection to gather this information, even if such tests carry risks. The nuanced ways we gather and use information about reputation highlight the immense sophistication required for sustained reciprocal interactions in complex social groups. While kin selection and reciprocity explain many forms of helpful behavior and cooperation, they often struggle to fully account for the ultra-sociality characteristic of humans, our unparalleled ability to cooperate in very large groups of non-relatives, far beyond what's seen in most other primates. This is where group selection and cultural selection become crucial, offering powerful additional explanatory layers. Elliot Sober and David Sloan Wilson, prominent evolutionary biologists, have meticulously shown how genuine fitness-sacrificing behavior can be favored through group selection, even if individuals within the group are at a disadvantage relative to non-helpers in their own group.
How does that work? It sounds counterintuitive.
It does, initially. Imagine a larger population divided into many smaller groups. Within each group, helpers, individuals who sacrifice some of their own reproductive capacity to benefit others in their group, might have lower individual fitness than non-helpers in that same group. However, if groups with a higher proportion of helpers are significantly more productive, cohesive, or successful at outcompeting other groups, for example in resource competition or warfare, those helper groups can grow and reproduce faster, contributing more individuals to the larger population.
So the group's success lifts the helpers overall, even if they lose out within the group.
Precisely. Even if the helpers within their group are individually disadvantaged, the overall success of the helping group can lead to an increase in helpers across the entire population. This is a real-world example of Simpson's paradox, where a trend observed within subgroups, helpers doing worse than non-helpers, reverses when the groups are combined. Helpers increase in frequency in the total population. So the fitness sacrificing trait spreads not because it benefits the individual helper directly, but because groups containing it are more successful.
That's a powerful idea, truly expanding our understanding beyond just the simplistic, selfish gene narrative. If selection can operate effectively at the group level, does that mean individual sacrifice is always ultimately for the group? Or are there still tensions we need to be aware of? And how does this interact with our unique human capacity for culture?
That's precisely the tension. Even with group selection, there's always an intra-group pressure for individuals to be selfish. A group full of helpers will be successful, but within that group, a selfish individual who benefits from other sacrifices without contributing would have higher individual fitness. So group selection is a delicate balance, and it's rarely the sole answer.
Okay.
However, you're right, it gets even more compelling and uniquely human when we factor in culture. Natural selection isn't concerned essentially with genes. It operates wherever there's trait variation, heritability, transmission, and trait-dependent differential reproduction.
Right. It can apply to ideas or practices, too.
Exactly. Cultural group selection occurs when culturally transmitted traits, things like social norms, specific practices, beliefs, technologies, or moral codes affect the persistence and proliferation of groups. A group with cultural practices that encourage strong cooperation, shared resources, or effective punishment of non-cooperators might be more resilient, innovative, or successful at outcompeting other groups. These successful cultural traits then spread as other groups adopt them or as the successful groups expand.
So culture itself can be selected for at the group level.
Yes. This is especially relevant for understanding the evolution of punishment of non-reciprocators, which is so central to human morality and social order. While administering punishment often comes at a cost to the punisher, e.g. risk of retaliation, energy expenditure, cultural group selection can strongly favor such traits because the cost to the individual administrator is typically low relative to the significant collective benefit it provides to the group by enforcing cooperation and deterring freeloaders. This makes it far more likely to evolve and persist than relying solely on direct reciprocal helpfulness.
That makes a lot of sense for maintaining large-scale cooperation.
It does. Furthermore, these processes can lead to a dynamic interaction known as cultural genetic coevolution. Cultural group selection creates an environment where prosociality, cooperation, and adherence to norms are heavily rewarded. This, in turn, creates new selective pressures on individuals, favoring genetic predispositions for psychological traits that enhance success in such a prosocial environment. Traits like strong prosocial motivations, a capacity for guilt, or an ability to internalize social norms.
So it's a feedback loop.
Precisely.
Yeah.
A powerful, positive feedback loop. Cultural evolution fosters the spread of prosocial genes, which in turn facilitate more complex and cohesive cultural structures. This cultural genetic coevolution is likely a unique and defining feature of human evolution, a significant part of what explains our extraordinary ultrasociality and our complex moral psychology.
That really brings it all together, showing the dynamic interplay between genes and culture. So if we look at real-world patterns in human behavior, like gift giving or even crime rates, do these evolutionary processes help explain some of the seemingly contradictory aspects of our social lives, perhaps even reinforcing that nepotistic streak we discussed earlier?
Absolutely. When we look at various human social phenomena, these evolutionary processes, kin selection, reciprocity, and cultural group selection, provide incredibly powerful explanatory tools, painting a much richer picture than a purely individualistic view. For instance, gift-giving is a universal human practice, but its patterns reveal that inherent nepotistic streak we talked about. Studies across diverse cultures have consistently shown that gifts tend to be given to non-kin, only with a relatively strong expectation of reciprocation, whereas gifts to close kin often come with virtually no expectation of direct return. This aligns perfectly with kin selection's predictions. You invest in kin because they carry your genes, regardless of immediate payback. Similarly, an extensive body of research by psychologists Martin Daly and Margot Wilson on homicide rates consistently shows that murder rates persistently differ between consanguineous blood family members and a final in-law family members across cultures, with significantly lower rates among blood relatives.
Wow, that's striking.
It is. This isn't just a cultural oddity. It's just a deep-seated, evolutionarily influenced reluctance to harm close genetic kin. Even knowledge of genetic relatedness has been shown to predict who takes sides in conflicts in small-scale societies like the Yanomamo. And in controlled experiments, studies have found that monozygotic, identical twins are significantly more likely to cooperate in prisoners' dilemma games than dizygotic fraternal twins, again reinforcing the genetic component of prosociality.
So the evidence lines up.
It does. All this empirical evidence reinforces the hypothesis that humans possess a strong, hardwired, nepotistic streak, which, to reiterate, is not to say that this love is selfish, but rather a genuine other-regarding affection that evolved due to its benefits for inclusive fitness. It powerfully demonstrates how these deep evolutionary forces continue to shape our most fundamental social interactions, even in complex modern societies, often in ways we aren't consciously aware of.
So we've talked about how we evolved to be helpful and cooperative, developing pro-social emotions like love, sympathy, and a capacity for strategic reciprocity. But is simply being nice the same as being moral? Here's where we move from those basic pro-social emotions to the truly unique human capacity for moral judgment itself. What's the critical gap between just feeling good about helping someone and actually making a moral judgment that something is right or wrong?
That's a truly critical distinction. And it's where the philosophical heart of our deep dive lies.
No.
While pro-social emotions like love, sympathy, and altruism are profoundly important to our moral lives and are the fuel for many morally laudable actions, they are fundamentally not sufficient for explaining morality itself.
Okay.
Immanuel Kant, centuries ago, famously highlighted this, arguing that while we might praise actions motivated by love, the emotion itself doesn't necessarily involve a moral judgment or a sense of duty. To illustrate this, simply acting in a way that we consider morally laudable isn't by itself evidence of an innate moral sense. Our source uses a great analogy. Imagine claiming humans have an innate arithmetical ability and then offering the fact that our ancestors had 10 fingers as proof.
Right. Correlation isn't causation.
It's exactly. The capacity for moral judgment is distinct from mere pro-social inclinations or the ability to count. You can easily imagine an individual who deeply loves another and simply doesn't want to cause them harm, perhaps even rushing to their aid in a crisis, yet fundamentally lacks any sense of obligation or judgment that harming them would be morally wrong. Emotions like love can exist without a corresponding sense of duty, ought, or a universal principle. Therefore, an explanation of how natural selection produced nice or virtuous humans with altruistic and sympathetic tendencies is only the start of an explanation for an innate moral faculty. It doesn't by itself explain how humans came to think about the world in specifically moral terms like justice, duty, or virtue.
It sounds like defining moral judgment itself is a bit of a meta-ethical minefield, like Socrates' dilemma, what is virtue? It's much harder than it seems to pin down exactly what constitutes a moral judgment. So meta-ethics isn't about what is right or wrong, but what right and wrong even mean. Like, are they real things out there or just how we feel? What are some of the complexities metaethics wrestles with when trying to understand the fundamental nature of a moral judgment?
You've perfectly captured the essence of metaethics. It's the philosophy about morality, not morality itself. And it is indeed extremely complex, and philosophers disagree widely on what a moral judgment fundamentally is. First, we can ask, is it primarily a mental event, something happening in our minds, or a linguistic utterance, something we say or write? We can allow for both. It's safest to go with the vernacular that a moral judgment can be either. But even focusing on linguistic utterances, disagreement reigns. What kind of utterance is it? Some philosophers argue moral judgments simply express commands, like saying don't steal. Others say they evince feelings, they're just a sophisticated way of saying boo stealing. Then there are those who claim moral judgments report facts.
Facts, like scientific facts.
Well, that's the question. What kind of facts? Facts about the speaker's personal preferences? Facts about their culture's norms? Facts about God's commands? Or are they about mind-independent, objective facts existing independently of human minds? A position known as moral realism. The field of metaethics attempts to navigate these bewildering options, trying to understand the fundamental nature and status of moral claims.
Wow, okay. Lots of options.
And the term express itself needs careful handling here. We're not talking about a simple causal relation, like Emily's anger causing her to kick a sandcastle. If she wasn't angry, we'd reject that explanation. But express can also refer to a linguistic convention. An insincere apology, for example, still expresses regret because that's how the language convention works, even if the speaker feels no genuine regret. Moral utterances, our source argues, express a far more complex relation than a simple causal link. They carry multiple layers of meaning and intention.
So if it's not simply a causal expression of feelings, then theories like pure non-cognitivism, which might suggest stealing is wrong, is just an exclamation of disapproval, are perhaps too simplistic.
Precisely. Pure non-cognitivism, as famously espoused by logical positivists like A.J. Ayer, claim that stealing money is wrong, doesn't express a truth-apt proposition, something that can be true or false, but is merely akin to saying stealing money, with a tone of disapproval or boo stealing. Our source argues this is far too extreme and fails to capture the richness of moral language.
How so?
Consider a more everyday analogy. That car is a gas guzzler. This statement is both descriptive, describes a car that consumes a lot of fuel, and it expresses a negative, evaluative attitude towards that car, especially, in an environmentally conscious context. The negative connotation isn't just an expectation based on past observation of people disliking gas guzzlers. It's a firmly entrenched convention of the term itself. Someone who didn't understand that gas guzzler carries a negative evaluation wouldn't fully understand the statement. You can't reduce that car as a gas guzzler to just shaking your head at a car. It also asserts a belief about its fuel consumption and expresses a critical attitude.
Okay, I see the parallel.
Similarly, stealing is wrong isn't merely an exclamation or a boo. It simultaneously asserts something about stealing, that it violates a certain standard, and expresses a conative acceptance, essentially, an endorsement or commitment of a standard that condemns the activity. It's not just a feeling, it's a mental buy-in to a rule, combining a belief-like element with a motivational push. This integrated view, where a moral judgment expresses both a belief and a motivation implicating state, captures the complexity much better than pure non-cognitivism.
That helps clarify it. But there's something more, isn't there? A feeling that moral judgments carry a special weight, a unique kind of binding force, an oomph, as our source puts it. It's not just that we dislike stealing, it feels like it's wrong, and that wrongness applies universally, regardless of our personal feelings or even our desires. It commands.
Yes, that oomph is absolutely crucial to understanding what makes morality distinct. It's what philosophers refer to as practical clout, which is a powerful combination of two elements: moral inescapability and moral authority. Moral inescapability means you can't simply opt out of a moral prescription by saying, well, I don't personally care about that rule. For example, you can't logically evade the moral claim, don't kill innocent people, by simply citing a strong desire to do so. Moral claims feel like they bind us irrespective of our personal desires or interests.
Right, you can't just say, I don't care.
Exactly. But there's an extra authority on top of that, what we call moral authority. This aligns beautifully with the Kantian intuition that moral claims possess a special categorical binding force, quite unlike other kinds of rules. To illustrate this, imagine a strange fictional cult in Idaho that believes everyone simply must dye their hair purple. This is a categorical imperative, a rule that applies irrespective of whether you care about the cult or purple hair. If you tell them, "I don't care about your silly cult or its rules," they might earnestly respond, "There's nothing in the rules about caring. You simply must dye your hair purple." But you would, and should, remain entirely unmoved. Their rule, despite being categorical, fundamentally lacks true moral authority.
It's just wimpy, as the source says.
Precisely. It's wimpy. Moral claims, unlike cult rules, purport to bind us whether we care or not, possessing a unique practical authority that demands our adherence and often elicits public condemnation if violated. It is this peculiar, inescapable clout that naturalistic accounts of morality often find incredibly challenging to accommodate. Now let's consider the actual content of morality itself, moving from the meta-ethical nature of moral judgments to what they actually judge. Despite seemingly vast cultural variations, cross-cultural studies consistently reveal striking universals in moral systems, strongly suggesting a shared evolutionary purpose for morality. Our sources highlight 4 broad categories found across diverse societies, from small indigenous groups to large modern nations.
Okay, what are they?
First, there are pervasive negative appraisals of harming others. Every moral system in some form condemns certain acts that cause physical, emotional, or social harm. Second, we find widespread values of reciprocity and fairness. The idea of tit for tat, of giving and taking fairly, of proportional punishment and reward is a foundational element in nearly all human societies. Third, there are consistent requirements for status-appropriate behavior. This involves understanding social hierarchies, respecting elders or leaders, and acting accordingly to maintain social order. And fourth, almost universally, we find regulations around bodily matters, such as purity and pollution concepts, often related to menstruation, food taboos, bathing rituals, sexual conduct, and the handling of corpses. These rules often seem culturally specific, but the category of regulating the body is ubiquitous.
So the first 3 categories you mentioned, harming others, reciprocity and fairness, and status-appropriate behavior, powerfully suggest that morality isn't just arbitrary cultural convention. It really sounds like morality is fundamentally for protecting and sustaining social order, for resolving interpersonal conflicts, and for combating the purely individualistic, self-serving pursuits that could tear a group apart.
Precisely. The prevalence and importance of these first 3 categories across such a wide spectrum of cultures lead to a robust and compelling conclusion. A significant, perhaps even primary portion of any human moral system is designed to protect and sustain social order, to effectively resolve interpersonal conflicts, and to combat the unchecked, rampant pursuit of individual welfare that would undermine group cohesion. The moral domain is heavily invested in how humans may harm each other, emphasizing morality's crucial function as a powerful social glue. While the fourth category, regulations around bodily matters, might at first glance seem more self-regarding, it often carries deep social and symbolic implications within a given culture. For example, what appears as self-regarding dietary restriction from one cultural viewpoint may be a deeply social marker of group identity or purity from another. This practical social function is key to understanding morality's profound adaptive value. Beyond pro-social emotions and the overarching social norms, there's a crucial, often overlooked, missing piece that is absolutely essential to what makes morality moral in a distinctly human way: the concept of desert.
Desert. As in, what someone deserves.
Exactly, what one deserves. To grasp this, let's conduct a thought experiment. Imagine a species of highly intelligent creatures who possess emotions, can communicate, and even follow social rules, but who have no concept of what one deserves.
Okay, I'm imagining.
Without the concept of desert, such creatures would lack a central element of human justice. The idea of getting what one is due, whether it's a reward or a penalty. They wouldn't be troubled, for example, by the public chastisement of an innocent person if it served some expedient purpose, like deterring others from similar acts. If we exclaimed, "But that's unjust, he didn't deserve to be treated that way," they simply wouldn't comprehend the force of our argument.
Wow, that's a chilling thought.
It is. Furthermore, and profoundly, without a sense of desert, these creatures could have no genuine sense of guilt, for guilt fundamentally involves the self-judgment that one deserves some kind of penalty or condemnation for one's actions. They would lack a moral conscience as we understand it, our uniquely human capacity to genuinely appreciate a Hollywood movie where the villain finally gets their richly deserved comeuppance, or to feel a deep, unsettling disquiet when a wrongdoer escapes justice, is deeply tied to this fundamental concept.
Yeah, that feeling is powerful.
It ties directly into the intuitive, yet often mysterious idea of moral equilibrium. When a wrong is done, our intuitive sense is that a fundamental moral equilibrium in the world or within our social fabric has been upset. Punishment, in this view, is the process that restores that equilibrium, bringing a deep, often visceral sense of satisfaction. While this notion of equilibrium sounds highly mysterious if examined critically through a purely empirical lens and without invoking supernatural forces, it powerfully captures a distinctive and profoundly human aspect of our morality. A profound dissatisfaction with a human killer who simply got away versus a crocodile who simply got away from a crime scene highlights this crucial difference. The crocodile doesn't deserve punishment. The human does, because they are an agent capable of moral desert.
This is a profound observation. So if desert is so central, guilt then must be a cornerstone emotion in maintaining this moral equilibrium. If you don't feel guilt, you can't truly understand desert, or perhaps even the idea of justice itself. It really seems to fuel our moral compass from within.
Exactly. Guilt is absolutely central, acting as a powerful internalized self-punishment system that guides our moral conduct. It involves judging oneself guilty of a transgression, and it's a key part of repentance, making amends, and restoring one's standing within a community. We are deeply disquieted by criminals who serve their time but show no contrition or remorse, even if they pose no further threat to society. We often feel the punishment hasn't truly worked because the moral equilibrium, particularly within the individual, isn't restored from within.
Right, the internal sense of wrongness hasn't been acknowledged.
Precisely. This understanding of guilt develops surprisingly early in childhood. Studies show that 6-year-olds and all 8-year-olds rate a smiling transgressor's face as worse or less appropriate than a sad face, indicating an early grasp of appropriate guilt and the recognition that a lack of contrition is itself a transgression. An incapacity for guilt is considered a dangerous vice because it removes a crucial internal mechanism for reliably guiding moral conduct. Guilt directs moral conduct from the inside, forming the very core of our conscience. Without it, the practical clout of morality, its inescapable authority, would be significantly diminished. It's an essential part of our internal moral enforcement system.
So if emotions and concepts like desert are so key to our unique moral sense, how do they become so deeply intertwined with our evolving language? We often talk about animals having social rules and displaying empathy, but you argue that even our closest relatives, chimpanzees, don't make moral judgments in the same way we do. What's the fundamental cognitive difference?
This is a truly crucial area of inquiry where evolutionary biology meets philosophy of mind. While primatologists like Franz de Waal have shown compelling evidence for what he calls precursors to morality in apes, things like empathy, reconciliation, and reciprocity, he himself distinguishes between descriptive and prescriptive social rules.
Okay.
Apes might follow descriptive rules, recognizing regularities in behavior and anticipating consequences. They also clearly learn to avoid hostility by behaving in ways that minimize negative consequences. They're aware of accepted versus unaccepted behaviors. They know what will likely provoke aggression. However, de Waal himself notes it's unclear if this equates to an awareness of good and bad or just and unjust in a human moral sense, precisely because non-human apes lack verbal language for the cognitive formulation and communication of abstract rules.
The language piece is critical.
It really is. The core difference then lies in the acceptable versus accepted divide. Chimpanzees are aware of what's accepted, what social behaviors will, in practice, provoke hostility from others. But this is fundamentally different from understanding what is acceptable, what merits hostility, or what is truly wrong. The should they might possess is a should of prediction, like saying it should rain tomorrow, meaning it's likely based on past observation. This is not the moral should of one should refrain from killing innocent people, which implies a judgment of merit, obligation, and universal applicability.
Got it. Predictive versus prescriptive.
Exactly. Without concepts of merit and desert, as we discussed earlier, calling chimpanzee aggression moralistic is really just a metaphor. Their punishment is better understood as a negative response, driven by aversive learning, inhibitions, and desires to enforce their own immediate interests or dominance. We can fully explain chimpanzee behavior using these concepts without crediting them with complex moral thoughts about transgressions, universal prohibitions, or deserved punishments. They simply lack the sophisticated conceptual framework that only language provides, making true human-like moral judgments beyond their grasp. They operate on a different cognitive plane. This leads us, rather inevitably, to the absolutely crucial role of language in the evolution of our moral sense. Why do terms like dork, slut, evil, just, or virtuous seem entirely unavailable to animals? Because such complex, socially loaded concepts fundamentally require an acquaintance with how these words function within a public language and a shared cultural context.
Okay, you need the shared understanding.
Precisely. You can't truly have the belief that Seymour is a dork without understanding the intricate social conventions, the derogatory connotations, and the shared cultural norms surrounding the word dork. It's more than just a description. It's an evaluation embedded in a linguistic community. This observation challenges certain philosophical realist views about beliefs, which sometimes posit beliefs as sentences in the head residing in some universal mentalese language. How could this mentalese contain a term that smoothly translates dork with all its derogatory, culturally specific connotations? It simply can't. While instrumentalism might allow us, for predictive value, to ascribe evaluative beliefs to chimps, treating it as a convenient fiction, to predict their behavior, we shouldn't take such ascriptions seriously as a reflection of their true cognitive states. As humans, when we say a computer thinks the printer port is free, we know we're speaking loosely using a metaphor. We'd back down under serious questioning. We don't do that when talking about deeply held human beliefs. This suggests that without the intricate social and conceptual framework provided by language, the rich, evaluative concepts central to morality are simply not accessible to non-human animals.
So language isn't just a tool for communication, it's fundamental to forming these evaluative concepts that animals seem to lack, opening up an entirely new realm of moral thought. How did this capacity for language, which is so critical to morality, evolve in the first place? I've heard about the gossip hypothesis for language evolution, which sounds delightfully human.
The gossip hypothesis, primarily developed by Robin Dunbar and Leslie Aiello, offers a compelling and truly insightful explanation for language evolution, linking it directly to our social needs. It stems from two key observations. First, in non-human primates, social cohesion and bonding are maintained through constant, time-consuming grooming behavior. There's a limited social budget, about 20% of their waking time, an individual can devote to this without compromising other vital activities like foraging or avoiding predators.
Okay.
Second, there's a strong correlation between neocortex ratio, the size of the neocortex relative to the rest of the brain, and typical group size in primates. Larger groups generally have larger neocortices, suggesting the neocortex is primarily processing complex social information.
Bigger brains for bigger groups.
Yeah, essentially, yes. Using fossilized crania to estimate brain size, Dunbar and Aiello theorized that early hominid groups grew progressively larger over time. The critical problem arose when group sizes, estimated for Homo erectus, reached around 111 individuals. At this size, maintaining social cohesion through one-on-one grooming would have required over 30% of an individual's time, far exceeding the sustainable social budget.
Not enough hours in the day for grooming.
Precisely. Language, they argue, emerged as a brilliant and far more efficient solution. Instead of costly one-on-one grooming, you could gather vast amounts of social information by simply talking to others, quickly learning about who was trustworthy, who was a cheat, who was a reliable ally, and who was a potential threat. This allowed for social bonding and reputation management in much larger groups. This is why, even today, we spend a staggering 60–70% of our conversational energy on reputation management, essentially advanced gossip.
That's incredible that language, this complex human faculty we associate with poetry and philosophy, might have evolved primarily out of the need to gossip and manage reputations.
Hey.
And it makes perfect sense that this very first language of gossip would have immediately incorporated valuative terms. Og is a scoundrel has a much more practical punch than Og did X.
Absolutely. The earliest language, emerging from this need for gossip and trade, would necessarily include evaluative terms to be functional. Our ancestors didn't just want to describe who did what, they urgently needed to criticize defectors and praise cooperators to manage social alliances. Imagine an early hominid saying, Og never repaid Gak for that axe, the scoundrel. Or, conversely, Klug always repays a favor. He's a great guy, very reliable. This explicit evaluative language was crucial for managing reputations, identifying cheats and free riders, and enforcing social norms, making reciprocal exchanges more reliable and extending trust in larger groups.
So language turbocharged social regulation?
In a big way. Moreover, this evaluative language would have provided a powerful boost to establishing what we call convention-transcendent norms. If Gak can assert that Og has violated a norm that must be respected by everyone, whether one personally likes Og or not, that Og deserves to be punished. This provides far more motivational force to inspire communal condemnation or punishment than simply expressing personal anger. Moral language transforms a personal dislike or a mere social convention into a public universally binding judgment, which inherently carries practical clout. This capacity fundamentally enhances social cohesion and stability in ways mere non-moral evaluations or simple emotional outbursts cannot. It's the language of ought entering the social arena. Now let's circle back to emotions and their interplay with cognition. While some emotions, like basic forms of love or fear, might be present in many animals, certain emotions are what we call cognitively rich, meaning they deeply involve and often require complex concepts. This is why our discussion of emotions naturally follows language. The evolution of language essentially made certain more sophisticated moral emotions accessible to us. While many emotions lie outside voluntary control and exhibit universal, cross-cultural, and neurologically identifiable bases, the fascinating question is how they interact with our higher cognition and our unique human capacity for conceptual thought.
Right, like disgust.
Exactly. Disgust is a great example. Core disgust is clearly linked to food rejection, an innate defense mechanism to avoid pathogens and toxins. But human disgust is far more sophisticated and conceptual. It includes a profound feeling of offensiveness and contamination that goes beyond physical threats. Think about how many people feel a deep reluctance to wear a sweater previously worn by a notorious murderer, even after it's been scrupulously laundered and sterilized.
Yeah, definitely wouldn't want to do that.
Right. This isn't just about pathogens, it's about a symbolic, conceptual contamination, an essence that requires sophisticated cognitive and linguistic categorization. Or consider the common aversion to drinking perfectly clean apple juice from a brand new, never-used bedpan. The object's cultural associations, not its physical properties, trigger the disgust.
That's a good point.
Importantly, these cognitively rich emotions don't necessarily require beliefs in the full sense. I argue against the Stoic view, which equated emotions with beliefs. You can be absolutely terrified by a horror movie vampire without actually believing vampires exist. Your brain registers the thought of vampires as threatening and processes it emotionally, even if you don't affirm it as a factual belief. The thought, as a mental state with specific content, provides the content of your fear.
So the thought alone is enough to trigger the emotion.
Yes. This means that an emotion can involve the deployment of complex concepts, like vampire, even if you don't hold a fully affirmed belief in the reality of its object. This is a crucial distinction for understanding how moral emotions can function, even in the context of moral skepticism.
That's a fascinating distinction, that complex concepts can be involved in emotions, even without full-blown belief. It clears the way for understanding guilt as a central moral emotion that has this significant conceptual burden. How does guilt, in particular, guide moral conduct from the inside, essentially forming our conscience? And how does it differentiate itself from other related emotions like shame?
Guilt, along with shame and embarrassment, is a critical self-directed emotion that profoundly guides moral conduct from the inside. It is the very core of what we call our conscience, that inner voice that nudges us towards what we perceive as right and away from wrong. Charles Darwin himself, in his work on the descent of man, powerfully linked the moral sense with conscience, recognizing its internal, self-regulatory nature. Guilt is not merely not wanting to perform certain actions or simply disliking them. It's about not wanting to perform them because they're judged to be transgressions against a moral standard. The very word guilt, denoting both an emotion and a legal moral relation to a norm violation, is no accident. When one feels guilt, one judges oneself to be guilty. This intellectualization of a prosocial sentiment, where complex concepts like transgression, responsibility, and desert are deployed, is what truly elevates it to a distinctly human moral emotion.
And how is it different from shame?
That's a key distinction. We can clearly distinguish guilt from shame, though they are often confused. Guilt typically relates to specific actions for which amends can be made, for example, feeling guilty for telling a lie or for hurting someone's feelings. It prompts reparative action and a desire to make things right. Shame, on the other hand, often relates to one's being or identity feeling shame for being a liar, or for a physical characteristic like having a big nose, or for being perceived as weak. Shame encourages social withdrawal, hiding, or self-deprecation.
Ah, okay. Action versus being.
Precisely. Crucially, guilt is overwhelmingly elicited by harming others or violating fairness norms and leads to a self-judgment of deserving punishment. An incapacity for guilt is considered a profoundly dangerous vice in any society because it removes this crucial internal self-punishment system for reliably guiding moral conduct. So the evolution of the moral sense was indeed an untidy affair, an intricate dance where pro-social emotions, cognitive concepts, and language are deeply and inextricably entwined. Emotions like guilt, shame, and indignation are cognitively rich precisely because they rely on evaluative concepts made possible and shaped by language. We've now built up all the pieces. We've explored the origins of prosocial behaviors, the indispensable role of language, and the emergence of cognitively rich emotions like guilt. Now let's put it all together. What are the practical adaptive advantages of this uniquely human moral thinking? Why would natural selection favor a dedicated moral sense that goes beyond just being helpful or emotionally reactive? This is where we distill the adaptive function of our moral sense. The central hypothesis is elegantly simple. Sincerely judging an action as morally positive significantly increases the probability of performing it, and sincerely judging an action as morally negative significantly increases the probability of omitting it.
Okay.
If performing certain actions, especially complex cooperative ones, consistently enhanced reproductive fitness in ancestral environments, then any psychological mechanism that reliably ensures these actions will be strongly favored by natural selection. Self-directed moral judgment, or conscience, can serve precisely this purpose. The key here is that moral judgments are inherently motivation-implicating states. A canonical moral judgment, a sincerely made moral judgment one you truly believe, inherently involves a motivation to act.
It pushes you to do something.
Exactly. Think of it this way. If you sincerely judge it's wrong to leave your friend stranded, that judgment doesn't just sit there as an abstract thought. It inherently pushes you to offer a ride, even if it's inconvenient. It's not just a thought, it's a thought with a built-in do something button. This is vital because, in the realm of cooperation and long-term social investment, the benefits are often delayed and easily devalued by immediate short-term temptations, which can lead to weakness of will. Our hypothesis suggests that natural selection opted for a special, robust motivational mechanism for this realm, our moral conscience.
A way to overcome that short-term thinking.
Precisely. Moral judgments, such as, "It would be utterly reprehensible for me to do that," function as powerful conversation stoppers in our internal deliberation. They eliminate certain practical possibilities from our conscious consideration in a way that mere dislike or inconvenience, "I just don't like X" or "X is inconvenient," doesn't. They instill a profound sense of absolute requirement, binding a person whether they personally like it or not, and demanding not just avoidance, but often public disapproval if violated. This mechanism effectively silences further self-interested calculation when prudential reasoning can be easily hijacked by immediate gratification, making adaptive social behaviors like keeping promises or sharing resources far more likely to occur. It's a powerful form of personal commitment that strengthens resolve against temptation.
That makes a lot of sense, that moral judgment acts as a kind of internal commitment device, a conversation stopper, to ensure long-term adaptive behavior, even when short-term urges pull us elsewhere. But David Lottie raises a good challenge. Why evolve such a complex, intellectualized moral conscience when stronger, simpler desires for cooperation, like the raw intensity of parental love, achieve similar adaptive ends more directly and robustly? Few parents, for example, need a sense of duty or a moral judgment to protect their child. That raw, visceral emotion often suffices.
Lottie's challenge is indeed a strong and thoughtful one, and it pushes us to refine our understanding. While strong, direct desires like parental love are incredibly powerful, moral judgments offer something distinct and invaluable that strong desires alone cannot. They provide a basis for justification for actions, particularly within the public domain of a social group.
Ah, the public justification piece.
Yes. While a potent parental desire to protect offspring is robust and evolutionarily ancient, it doesn't provide a public, normative framework that binds everyone. If I simply dislike cheating, that's a personal preference. It explains my behavior, but it doesn't normatively bind others, nor is it a legitimate basis for me to demand their avoidance of cheating. However, if I judge that cheating is morally wrong, this is not just a statement of my personal preference. It's a claim that implicitly applies to everyone, demanding avoidance from all members of the community.
Right, it becomes a shared standard.
Exactly. It gives Mary, for instance, something powerful and shared to say in the public domain, to justify her outrage or even her corrective action, if Fred makes a sexist comment, beyond just her raw personal indignation. It provides a shared framework for interpersonal discourse, accountability, and the enforcement of collective standards. Even if the initial judgment might be driven by emotion and rationalized post hoc, that moral judgment still serves to bolster individual resolve and, crucially, to justify actions and enforce norms within a community. Morality, in this profound sense, isn't just about what I feel or desire, it's about what we collectively demand and endorse. This further leads us to see how moral judgments function as incredibly powerful social glue by serving as interpersonal commitments. My personal moral disapproval of an action, as opposed to simply disliking it, provides a robust basis for corresponding other directed moral judgments. Consider the difference. I won't pursue X because I don't like X is entirely about my personal preference. You won't pursue X because I don't like X makes little sense as a universally binding command.
Yeah, that doesn't work.
Right. But the pursuit of X is morally wrong. It's a fundamentally different kind of statement. It implicitly demands both my avoidance and yours. The two questions what benefits self-directed moral judgments bring and what benefits other-directed moral judgments bring are thus deeply and intricately entwined. Moral judgments provide a common currency for collective negotiation, deliberation, and decision-making within a group, uniting individual resolve with shared social expectations.
So it scales up cooperation.
It does. This shared justificatory structure is an exceptionally powerful tool for solving complex group coordination problems in a way that mere individual desires or emotions cannot. Crucially, while a strong negative emotion like anger can prompt a punitive response from an individual, it takes a moral judgment to truly license punishment within a communal context, making it legitimate and acceptable to the group. This makes punishment far more effective for governing large groups and enforcing norms than relying on non-moralized emotions alone, especially when emotions might be fickle or divided. Guilt, involving a self-directed judgment of deserved punishment, also serves the individual by inhibiting transgression before it even occurs.
So moral judgments become these incredibly powerful signals, a sophisticated way of communicating our deep commitment to shared norms, even if that signaling itself sometimes feels a bit paradoxical or counterintuitive.
Yes, the communication of these interpersonal commitments often has a paradoxical quality, famously explored by economist Robert Frank. Both personal and interpersonal commitments derive significant benefit from not deliberately aiming at that benefit. For personal commitments, replacing purely prudential calculation with moral thinking often serves one's prudential welfare better in the long run. If you are known as someone who always keeps their word because it's the right thing to do, even when inconvenient, you become a much more trustworthy and valuable partner.
Right, reputation matters.
Immensely. For interpersonal commitments, being seen by others as genuinely committed to what might even appear to be imprudent actions in the short term, like always cooperating even when you can secretly cheat, can be strategically advantageous. The signaling of that commitment becomes prudent because it unlocks greater long-term cooperation and trust, even if the individual action itself is costly. While Robert Frank, for instance, emphasizes emotional displays like blushing or flashing anger for signaling commitment, I would also strongly stress the crucial cognitive element of moral judgment.
Beyond just the emotions.
Yes. While emotional signals like tone of voice or visible indignation are certainly vital, the explicit moral judgment itself, the verbal declaration that this is wrong, is a uniquely powerful and sophisticated way to communicate commitment, even in the absence of obvious emotional cues. When we think of ourselves in moral terms, we are inherently thinking of ourselves in social terms, evaluating our actions and the actions of others against a collective shared justificatory framework. This deep entanglement means that the way a private moral judgment affects one's own resolve cannot be fully understood in isolation from its potential public declaration and its profound effect on others' resolve and perceptions. Turning now to the neurological side, groundbreaking scientific advances in neuroscience provide increasingly concrete evidence for the intimate and profound link between moral thought and emotion, profoundly challenging centuries of philosophical debate that often tried to separate reason from passion. The classic seminal case is that of Phineas Gage, an 1848 railway worker who suffered massive brain trauma when an iron rod passed entirely through his prefrontal cortex.
Ah, yes, the famous Phineas Gage.
Indeed. Miraculously, he survived physically, but his personality radically shifted. From temperate, conscientious, and responsible to crude, irresponsible, and utterly disrespectful of moral considerations. He could no longer keep his engagements and was dismissed for his antisocial behavior.
Just a completely different person.
Completely. More recent studies of individuals with similar, albeit usually less dramatic, damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, VMPFC, a condition now often called acquired sociopathy, consistently show a striking pattern. These individuals exhibit profound imprudence, chronic irresponsibility, an inability to form deep, lasting relationships, and a striking lack of regret or remorse for their harmful actions. Crucially, they also exhibit a dramatic dampening of emotional response, showing no skin conductance response, a measure of physiological arousal, to emotionally charged images, whether pleasant or horrific. This points to an incredibly strong and direct link between healthy moral deliberation, its effective implementation in behavior, and the robust capacity for emotional response. Further evidence comes from studies of psychopaths. Their specific moral impairment, a striking inability to distinguish moral transgressions, like harming another person without justification, from conventional transgressions, like breaking a dress code. A distinction that even young children grasp instinctively is consistently linked to an emotional deficit, not a rational one.
So they know the rules, but don't feel them.
That's a good way to put it. They can articulate moral rules, but they don't feel the moral force behind them. Furthermore, modern fMRI studies consistently reveal significant emotional brain activity during personal moral problems, like deciding whether to push a person off a bridge to save 5 others, and during punishment decisions in economic games like the ultimatum game, where people will reject unfair offers even at a cost to themselves. This neurological research provides compelling biological evidence for the emotional scaffolding of moral judgment.
What's truly fascinating here is that this scientific evidence gives us a very coarse-grained, yet incredibly powerful answer to how natural selection manipulated the human brain for moral judgment. It largely did so through emotional centers. It's not a purely rational, detached faculty, is it? It feels like our brains are integrating these ancient emotional systems into our most sophisticated ethical thought.
Precisely. This scientific evidence strongly suggests that natural selection manipulated and integrated emotional centers in the human brain to enable, inform, and drive moral judgment. It's not claiming that every moral judgment is a purely emotional episode or that rational moral reasoning doesn't exist, far from it, but it does provide significant empirical support for a long-standing philosophical view known as moral projectivism.
Moral projectivism. Okay, what's that?
Moral projectivism suggests that qualities that appear to be in the world, like an action having inherent pitifulness or wrongness, owe their appearance, their phenomenal presence, to the perceiver's internal mental life and emotional responses, rather than being objective, mind-independent properties of the situation itself. As the great philosopher David Hume put it, these are new creations of the mind, projections onto the world. So when an action seems wrong, it feels like we're detecting an inherent property of that action. But according to projectivism, our emotional response, our internal affective state, is actually the parent of that perceived wrongness, not merely its child or a reaction to it.
So we're painting the world with our feelings, essentially.
That's a good metaphor. Nothing is literally projected out of our heads like a movie projector, but our experience is structured as if moral qualities are real features of the world, binding us irrespective of our interests. And this is counterintuitive by necessity, because our conscious experience must present moral qualities as real, binding properties of situations for them to be effective as conversation stoppers and motivators.
So morality feels incredibly objective to us. It feels like it's out there in the world, an undeniable truth. But is it just our brains performing an elaborate adaptive trick, making it seem that way for evolutionary benefit?
Yes, that's precisely the projectivist hypothesis and one of its most compelling implications. It argues that this detection-like phenomenology, the powerful, intuitive feeling that morality is objective, that murder is wrong, is a fact just like the sky is blue, is actually an adaptive design feature. From an adaptive efficiency perspective, natural selection strongly favors this direct acquaintance phenomenology. It's a simpler, more efficient cognitive solution for navigating the complex social world than constantly having to acknowledge the mentalistic or subjective nature of our moral perceptions.
It cuts out a step in thinking.
Exactly. Imagine if our experience of a hot red fire wasn't of a fire being hot and red, but of us consciously having hot sensations and red sensations. That would be an immense cognitive burden, a distracting extra step in decision-making. For critical, rapid judgments like finding ripe fruit, avoiding a stalking leopard, or initiating cooperation, sensory or evaluative experience that constantly reminded us of its mentalistic nature would be a pointless extravagance and a distracting hindrance. Projectivism, therefore, is seen not as a cognitive extravagance, but as a predictable result of natural selection's tight-fisted efficiency in optimizing our brains for survival and reproduction.
And is there empirical evidence for this?
Yes, there is. Studies with young children consistently show that they treat subjective properties like yummy, as for some people, but good, in a moral sense, as for real and universally binding, suggesting that moral objectivism is the default setting on common sense metathics. It's how our minds naturally interpret moral claims.
Wow, even kids get that objective feel.
Yes. Children as young as 3 also distinguish moral transgressions, like hitting someone, which they consider wrong regardless of authority, from conventional ones, like breaking a classroom rule, which they understand is authority-dependent, a robust cross-cultural phenomenon that psychopaths notably lack. This authority-independent aspect aligns perfectly with the practical clout we discussed earlier. Even Rousseau's problem, the philosophical mystery of how you teach fundamental moral concepts like ownership or fairness to someone entirely without prior moral understanding, suggests that it's not purely learned external facts, but requires some pre-existing conceptual preparation or readiness in our evolved minds. This evolutionary hypothesis that moral judgment is an adaptive psychological mechanism for promoting social behavior, rather than a detector of objective moral facts itself, strongly suggests projectivism. A conversation stopper or a normative rule won't work effectively as an internal or external motivator if you perceive it as merely a conversation stopper or a socially constructed rule. It needs to feel like an objective truth. This projectivist lens also helps make sense of the often intractable nature of moral disagreement. If emotions are, to a significant extent, in the driving seat of our moral judgments, and these judgments are then projected onto the world as objective properties, it explains why moral disputes are often so passionate, so resistant to purely rational argument, and frequently lead to persistent impasses with no hope of resolution that satisfies both parties.
Because the feelings aren't changing.
Exactly. Without those underlying emotions, it's quite possible we might not make moral judgments at all. This genealogical thesis, tracing the evolutionary lineage of our moral capacities, thus profoundly explains the intellectualization, the transition from merely disliking to disapproving, from merely desiring to finding certain states desirable. A cognitive leap made possible by language, thus fulfilling Darwin's own puzzling assertion about the moralization process.
We've journeyed through the evolutionary landscape of morality, tracing its origins from pro-social behaviors and language to the very mechanisms in our brains that give us that powerful oomph of moral judgment. But now for the really big questions, the ones that touch on our deepest convictions. Does understanding where our moral sense comes from validate it, giving it a firmer, scientifically grounded foundation? Or does it, as some philosophers strongly argue, debunk it, undermining its very authority and our confidence in its objective truth?
This takes us into the thorny and often unsettling territory of genealogical debunking. To grapple with this, let's consider a thought experiment. Imagine you're given a belief pill that makes you believe something specific and arbitrary, say, that Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo.
Okay, the Napoleon pill.
Right. Now, if you later discovered, beyond any doubt, that your belief about Waterloo was caused solely by this pill, that the pill simply implanted the belief, irrespective of historical fact, it would certainly, and quite rationally, undermine your confidence in that belief. It doesn't definitively prove the belief is false, but it shows its origin is entirely independent of its truth value. The connection to reality is severed.
Okay, that makes sense.
We can extend this to an innate concept pill. Suppose there's a hypothetical Napoleon pill that, when taken, disposes you to form beliefs about Napoleon in general, creating the very concept of Napoleon in your mind. Without it, you'd have no such concepts. Discovering you took this pill would similarly undermine all your Napoleon beliefs, because the fundamental concept itself would be a product of an arbitrary, truth-independent biological or social process. Your conceptual framework for Napoleon wouldn't be reliably tracking a historical figure.
Right, the foundation is shaky.
Precisely. Applying this logic to morality, the argument goes, if our fundamental moral concepts like obligation, virtue, and desert are products of our specific social and biological ancestry, evolved mechanisms primarily to promote cooperation and reproductive fitness, and not to reliably track objective moral truths that exist independently in the universe, then knowing this should rationally lead us to what I call agnosticism regarding all positive beliefs involving these concepts. This is a profound and radical conclusion. It suggests we should cultivate an open mind about whether there is anything morally right or wrong, treating moral terms as if they describe features that simply aren't reliably there from a truth-tracking perspective.
But that feels incredibly counterintuitive and unsettling. What about innate beliefs that are undeniably reliable, like 1 + 1 always 2? We don't doubt that, even if it's innate. Why is morality fundamentally different in this regard?
That's a crucial distinction, and it goes to the heart of the debunking argument. Mathematical and logical beliefs like 1 + 1 = 2 or the law of non-contradiction are useful because they are true. False mathematical beliefs would be profoundly maladaptive if you're being chased by 3 lions and you falsely believe only 1 left after 2 ran away. You're in grave trouble.
Yeah, bad news.
Very bad news. Their adaptive value is intrinsically tied to their truth. Natural selection in these domains selects for truth-tracking abilities because those directly enhance survival. Moral beliefs, however, could be powerfully adaptive, even if false. If a particular set of moral beliefs, regardless of their objective truth value, promoted robust cooperation, social cohesion, and thus reproductive success in ancestral environments, say, a belief that lying is absolutely forbidden by the cosmic order, natural selection would strongly favor them.
So utility trumps truth for morality, potentially.
Potentially, yes. The belief's utility for social coordination would be paramount, not its correspondence to some objective moral realm. Natural selection in this domain is not necessarily a reliable truth-tracking process. If false beliefs lead to more offspring, that's the path taken. This crucial difference makes moral thinking a domain where its genealogical origin can genuinely, rationally undermine our confidence in its objective truth. It gives us a reason for agnosticism where we wouldn't have it for mathematics. This line of reasoning brings us to Gilbert Harman's influential challenge to moral realism. He argues that if we can fully explain our moral judgments, why we make them, how they influence us, their practical clout, without needing to posit the existence of objective moral facts, then Occam's razor suggests we shouldn't assume those moral facts exist.
The simplest explanation wins.
Right. Occam's razor, remember, is the principle that entities should not be multiplied unnecessarily. If a simpler explanation suffices, it's usually preferred. Michael Ruse echoes this, concluding that from an evolutionary perspective, the objective foundation for morality is redundant. We don't need it to explain anything we observe. The core problem for naturalistic attempts to salvage objective morality, as we touched on earlier, is accommodating the inescapable practical authority we intuitively attribute to moral values, that powerful practical clout.
That oomph.
It's exactly the oomph. Moral claims purport to bind us, irrespective of our personal desires, interests, or cultural background. As the philosopher J.L. Mackie correctly observed, a moral judgment involves, quote, a call for action or for the refraining from action, and one that is absolute, not contingent upon any desire or preference or policy or choice, his own or anyone else's. We don't retract our condemnation of a serial killer, for instance, even if he sincerely claims no regret and expresses an absolute preference for his actions. Children, too, understand that moral transgressions are wrong regardless of what an authority figure might say or command, unlike conventional rules. Naturalistic theories often struggle profoundly to provide this kind of clout. They typically either try to accommodate it by linking it to reasons a fully rational agent would have, or they simply deny that such authority is a true essential requirement for something to count as morality. But if naturalism cannot account for this unique categorical authority that is so central to our moral experience, it arguably fails to explain a fundamental feature of what we intuitively understand morality to be.
So it's like trying to explain water without wetness.
That's a good analogy. Consider the witch versus simultaneity analogy. When scientific discoveries revealed no evidence of diabolical supernatural forces, the concept of a witch was effectively discarded because its core problematic element, evil magical influence, was inseparable from its function, condemning and killing certain women. You couldn't have a witch without the magic. By contrast, the concept of simultaneity was revised by Einstein's theory of relativity from absolute to relative, because the problematic element, absolute simultaneity, could be excised without losing its fundamental function for everyday use. For morality, it's deeply unclear if its inescapable authority can simply be discarded or reinterpreted without fundamentally losing what makes it moral at all in the human sense.
So if naturalism struggles so deeply to account for this inherent clout and universal binding force of moral judgment, and non-naturalism or supernaturalism also face Harman's challenge of explanatory redundancy, that we don't actually need to posit objective moral facts to explain our moral judgments, where does that leave us? It feels like we're at a philosophical crossroads.
You're right. It feels like a profound philosophical dilemma. And this detailed analysis significantly strengthens the genealogical debunking argument, leading us towards what I define as moral skepticism. If our best scientific and philosophical explanation of moral judgment doesn't require or even implicitly suggest the existence of objective moral facts, and if naturalistic attempts to incorporate such moral facts fall short of capturing morality's distinctive and inescapable clout, then we are left with no compelling reason to believe in objective moral facts.
So skepticism, but not necessarily nihilism.
Exactly. The conclusion isn't moral nihilism, which is the positive belief that all moral judgments are definitively false. Instead, it's a more nuanced form of moral skepticism in the sense of agnosticism, reserving judgment on moral propositions because the available evidence neither confirms nor reliably denies their truth. It's like having no particular reason to believe that the number of hairs on my head is odd, but also no particular reason to disbelieve it. We remain open-minded, acknowledging that moral beliefs could be true, but we ultimately lack reliable epistemic grounds for thinking so based on their evolutionary history.
So it's a we don't know and maybe can't know for sure position.
Precisely. This awareness is like taking the antidote pill from our thought experiment. It forces us to critically reevaluate our moral beliefs and, if we wish to maintain them, to seek more robust and independent grounds than their mere evolved presence. Some philosophers might argue that an evolutionary genealogy justifies beliefs through a process known as reliabilism, where natural selection is seen as a reliable truth-tracking process. However, as we've discussed, natural selection is not reliable in all domains. If false beliefs or non-truth-tracking mechanisms bring more offspring, that's what it will favor without hesitation. Moral thinking, I argue, could very well be such a domain where adaptive utility takes precedence over objective truth-tracking. Our moral compass points in a direction that's useful for social survival, not necessarily towards a universal North Star.
So what does this deep dive into the evolution of our moral compass really tell us about living with an adapted mind, a mind that's been shaped by millions of years of evolutionary pressures? The idea that our most fundamental judgments about right and wrong might be a product of those pressures, optimized for social cohesion rather than for detecting some objective moral reality, is it's a lot to chew on and perhaps even a bit unsettling for some.
Indeed. It leads us, as we've concluded, to a form of moral agnosticism. Not nihilism, but a critical and reflective stance. It means recognizing that while our moral sensibility has a profound and demonstrable history rooted in natural selection, this doesn't automatically grant our moral judgments an objective truth or universal authority. It's a subtle but crucial point. Even Charles Darwin himself, for all his revolutionary insights, struggled with this very tension. He confidently held his Victorian moral views, yet candidly acknowledged that a species descended from bee-like ancestors would have radically different sacred duties, such as killing their brothers and fertile daughters.
Wow, that's quite a thought experiment from Darwin.
Isn't it? This suggests he implicitly understood the culturally and evolutionarily contingent nature of morality, even as he adhered to his own deep-seated ethical convictions.
But crucially, and this is a common fear, this doesn't mean anything goes, right? If there's no objective moral duty, why bother being good? Why not just descend into chaos?
Absolutely not. This is a critical point to assuage any appalled outrage or fear of moral anarchy. It's a grave mistake to assume that without a transcendent objective moral duty, there are suddenly no reasons whatsoever to refrain from stealing a spoon, or worse. To claim otherwise is to suggest that the only thing standing between us and a life of utter savagery is a belief in some objective moral truth, which frankly is a truly depressing and unsupported thought.
Yeah, that seems unlikely.
Right. Just as religious atheism doesn't lead to societal breakdown. Indeed, countries with high percentages of atheists are hardly renowned for degeneracy. Understanding the evolutionary basis of our pro-sociality actually reveals many robust, plain, and compelling reasons for cooperative and ethical behavior. We are, at our core, deeply social creatures, and major irreplaceable satisfactions in life come from sincere participation in a community, from genuine relationships, and from being perceived as a trustworthy member of that community. Even if moral beliefs serve to bolster motivation ancestrally, we have inherent social motivations today that powerfully and reliably encourage pro-social conduct. Our well-being is intimately tied to the well-being of our social groups.
And what about our moral emotions then? If we're embracing agnosticism about objective moral beliefs, does that mean we stop feeling guilt or indignation or moral disgust?
Not at all, and this is a vital nuance. Our earlier discussion on emotions showed that even cognitively laden emotions don't necessarily require beliefs in the objective truth of their content. Mere thoughts or concepts can suffice to trigger them.
Right. The thought is enough.
Exactly. Just as a rational adult might not believe in cooties, yet still feel a powerful, visceral disgust towards drinking perfectly good apple juice from a brand new, perfectly clean bedpan, or towards a murderer's laundered sweater, our moral emotions can persist as powerful influences. They are, after all, deeply ingrained mechanisms from our adapted mind, honed by evolution. We can acknowledge the evolutionary story for why core disgust might have evolved to imperfectly track ancestral pathogen threats, while still experiencing its more sophisticated manifestations like moral disgust or guilt, even if we are epistemically agnostic about the objective truth of the moral judgments they might imply. These emotions are simply part of our evolved psychological architecture, and they continue to shape our experience of the world.
So the provocative question for you, the listener, becomes, How do you navigate your world, your daily decisions, and your most intimate relationships, knowing that your moral compass might be a finely tuned evolutionary instrument, incredibly optimized for social survival and cohesion, rather than a direct, unerring window to a universal moral truth? What new insights does this deep dive offer for how you live your life with an adapted mind, one that evolved to feel morality as objective?
And what further explorations might this understanding provoke for you? The conversation certainly doesn't end here. It simply shifts to a deeper, more critical level of self-awareness.
Indeed. That's all the time we have for this deep dive into the evolution of morality. Thank you for joining.